Welcome to the Mortuary Masterclass, brought to you by the Champion Company, where preservation meets purpose, and every step is part of your journey to safer solutions. In this episode, let's talk about something every embalmer has heard mentioned, but not always explained in a way that truly connects to day-to-day work: formaldehyde exposure in the prep room. Formaldehyde has been part of embalming for generations. It gave this profession consistency, reliability, and control at a time when families needed answers and time mattered. It's the bedrock that helped build modern embalming as we know it today. That history deserves respect. At the same time, like anything we've relied on for a long time, it's worth understanding how it affects us, not just what it does. Concern around formaldehyde exposure began in part from animal studies where lifetime exposures to high levels of formaldehyde caused nasal tumors in rodents. Later human and occupational studies have also linked formaldehyde exposure with certain cancers, including nasopharyngeal cancers and some forms of leukemia, which is why major health agencies classify it as a known human carcinogen. Because formaldehyde is also a strong irritant to the eyes, nose, throat, and respiratory tract, regulatory bodies set limits on occupational exposures to protect workers in settings like prep rooms. Right now, OSHA's permissible exposure limits for formaldehyde are 2 parts per million, or ppm, as a 15-minute short-term exposure limit, also known as STEL, and 0.75 parts per million as an 8-hour time-weighted average, sometimes written as TWA. There's also an action level of zero point 0.5 parts per million, where increased monitoring and training are required under the OSHA standard. It's worth noting that OSHA limits are regulatory minimums. Other organizations recommend much lower exposure targets. So what actually keeps exposure down in real prep rooms? This is where things get practical. In multiple workplace ventilation studies, researchers found that engineering controls like exhaust and supply airflow can drastically reduce airborne formaldehyde levels when properly designed and maintained. Well-ventilated prep rooms can reach the equivalent of 12 to 15 or more complete air exchanges per hour, which significantly dilutes and removes vapors. And that airflow matters more a lot. To evaluate exposure, arterial fluids from multiple manufacturers were compared using a simulated embalming setup, where embalming solution was introduced at realistic flow rates, and airflow drew vapors away from the operator's breathing zone. What they found is one of the most important takeaways. When proper ventilation and good technique were used together, measured airborne formaldehyde levels dropped substantially. In well-controlled conditions, airborne levels were often reduced by approximately 80 to 90% compared to poorly ventilated rooms. That's not chemistry magic. That's airflow and a method of doing heavy lifting. Now here's the next milestone. When fluids containing lower formaldehyde content, including glutaraldehyde-based formulations, were introduced, exposure dropped even further. In controlled comparisons, glutaraldehyde-dominant fluids produce significantly lower airborne formaldehyde readings than high formaldehyde arterial fluids under the same ventilation and work practices. And when glutaraldehyde fluids with minimal formaldehyde content were used, measured airborne formaldehyde levels often dropped near or below detection limits in well-ventilated environments. If you were looking at the charts while reading Champion's expanding encyclopedia, you'd see this clearly. Each arterial fluid clusters according to its chemical index. Higher index, higher measured airborne readings. Lower index, lower readings. Not identical across all rooms and conditions, but the pattern is consistent and hard to ignore. Cavity fluids told a slightly different story. Measurements showed a wider range and more variability than arterial fluids, likely because cavity fluids are used undiluted and often contain higher concentrations of methanol and other volatile components that can contribute to vapor emission. In plain terms, some of your highest exposures in the prep room come during cavity treatment. So, what does all of this mean for embalmers standing in the prep room today? Whether you've been embalming for decades or are fresh out of mortuary college, it means exposure isn't just about what fluid you use. It's about your roadmap, ventilation, technique, fluid choice. When those three line up, exposure drops dramatically. Formaldehyde still has a role. Its early fixation and rapid reaction can be valuable in certain challenging cases, and that legacy remains part of this profession's foundation. But the on-ramp to safer solutions comes from understanding the tools we already have and using them intentionally. Better airflow, smarter technique, lower emission chemistry when the case allows. That's not turning away from tradition. That's building onto it. And that's how this profession continues forward, one informed choice at a time, moving confidently toward the next milestone on the journey to safer solutions. Thanks for tuning in to this special edition of the Mortuary Masterclass, championing the prep room with purpose, because embalmers matter, and every step forward is part of your journey to safer solutions. That's the champion difference.